Well, here we are at the end of Isaiah chapter 53. Now, this could end up being a two-parter. We'll just have to see. Isaiah 53 is, in many ways, the centre of the Old Testament. You could even say it's the centre of the whole Bible. And verses 4 to 6 are almost certainly the most well-known part of Isaiah 53. And if you're not that familiar with Isaiah 53, you should be. You should get it imprinted deeply on your mind and on your heart. But we're going to look at the last three verses now. And in many ways, they explain what it's all about. It's about what all the gospel, what the cross is all about. So let's read it first of all. Let's read all three verses. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he has poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Right, let's work our way through this. Let's first of all start with the first bit. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And the verse before it, which you can actually see up there on the screen, says he'd done no violence, there was no deceit in his mouth. He'd lived a life of perfect obedience to the Father. And yet it was God's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Now, we can't get our heads around that. We can't understand it. The disciples couldn't understand it. Remember, anytime Jesus spoke to them about the cross, they were either utterly shocked or it just went straight over their heads. The most famous incident is Peter. When Jesus told him he would be handed over and killed, and Peter said to him, "Never, Lord, this shall not happen to you." And what did Jesus say to him? "Get behind me, Satan." And Islam has an enormous problem with this. They cannot understand how the servant of God, the prophet of God, as they see him, could possibly want him or allow him to die an ignominious death on a cross. We cannot understand this by our own reasoning. We need God to tell us. So let's listen to what he says. And there are two fundamental reasons why how could God send his son to the cross and allow him to go through all that? In fact, look, it was the Lord's will to crush him. God, the Father, crushed the Son on the cross. There are those who say, well, it's cosmic child abuse or some nonsense like that. And it is nonsense because they're a complete lack of understanding. But there is one point, they have got one point of truth, and that is the utter horror, awfulness of what was happening on the cross. So why did it have to be like that? One reason is our sin. We do not appreciate the full nature of our sin. You don't appreciate how awful your sin is. I don't appreciate how awful my sin is. The world does not appreciate it. Oh, I know. Yeah, I've told you sin is the biggest problem. Look, I understand a little of quantum mechanics. I understand a little of relativity. I don't really know them at all. It's like that with how deep and how terrible the consequences and the effects of sin and how deep sin runs in our lives. But God does. And because the problem is so deep So serious. That's one of the reasons why Jesus had to go to the cross. Because through his death on the cross, the problem of sin was dealt with. The second point for appreciating and understanding this is that the cross was not the end. Obviously, there's the resurrection. Now, it's needless to say, without the cross, you can't have the resurrection. On the resurrection, you can't have the cross. Oh, which way around? Which way do I mean? If you want the resurrection, you've got to have the cross. Jesus had to die first. But the two go together. So God sent in there. So it was the Lord's will to crush him. The Lord made his life an offering for sin. He took upon himself the penalty which should have been ours. But then the second part there, see, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. The death on the cross wasn't going to be the end. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. He was going to be raised from the dead. God's plans will prosper in the hands of Jesus, in the hands of the Son of God who died on the cross. Now, I said this is going to be at least a two-parter, so it'll be good about 6 minutes or so. So we'll have a wee break there and we'll come back to part 2 later.